In this slide, we'll be defining copyright and identifying pieces of work that have copyright. Copyright is legal protection for individuals or groups of individuals who've used creative expression to create tangible pieces of work. The individuals who are the copyright holders of a specific document have exclusive rights regarding the use of that document. They are able to reproduce the copyrighted work, prepare samples or depictions of that work. They can distribute copies as they see fit. They can give permission for someone to use their work in a different manner, use it in a presentation. They can perform the copyright work. And they can display the copyrighted work publicly wherever they so choose. Someone who isn't the copyright holder may sometimes want to use a work that has been copyrighted, and this is where determining fair use will come into the picture. Fair use will be discussed later in the presentation, but there is a legal and ethical moral way to use copyrighted material that does not break any of the copyright laws. Now let's take a minute to discuss some of the things that have copyright protection. First of all, just because a piece of work is not registered with the U.S. copyright does not mean that it's not covered under copyright protection. It is still the sole ownership of one person or a group of individuals that have created that, and it's the responsibility of the person who wants to use it to make sure that the proper procedures are taken to get permission to use the document in the manner that they wish to. Okay, some basic documents that have copyright protection that we are all aware of are big pieces of published literature, photographs, works of art, music, movies. Those are all basically public knowledge that there's a copyright law that protects those owners of those pieces of work. However, when using information in our classrooms, we sometimes use the internet to find smaller, not as widely known works, but they are still covered under copyright protection. And some of these may be recorded lectures or videos, blog posts, Twitter posts. These, once a person has taken the idea and put it down on paper or in the digital form, it is covered under copyright. So we just have to be careful about the ideas that we find on the internet and make sure that we give proper credit to the person whose idea it really was.
Copyright laws are ethical issues that should not be taken lightly. Like plagiarism, violating copyright laws is a punishable act. Violators pay fines or serve time in jail. Plagiarism occurs in writing and is defined as using someone's ideas or words without acknowledging them as being the creator. To avoid plagiarism, material that is not common knowledge must be cited using formatting such as APA or MLA. Copyright occurs in a variety of forms, such as dramatic works, and is defined as a property right that gives ownership of an original written or non-written work to its creator. The owner then has the ability to profit from the use or performance of this work. Copyright owners have protected rights to control distribution, reproduction, adaptation, public performance, and public display of their work. Once a work has been copyrighted, the proper steps must be taken in order to use the work. Copyright protection dates determine how many years a work can be protected. For example, all works copyrighted on or before December 31st, 1922 are public domain, while works copyrighted after 1978 are protected 70 years from the date of the author's death. Some works are unprotected by copyright laws. For example, facts, ideas, and works that are in public domain are not protected from public use. Copyright laws have 7 categories that range from literary works to choreographed works to motion pictures. Even though works are copyrighted, special conditions will allow for them to be used or copied. These conditions are the works are in public domain, the user has obtained the copyright owner's permission, a legal exception has been made, or fair use is involved.
Fair use is a copyright limitation. It takes some control away from the copyright holder and allows the masses to use that particular work in certain circumstances. According to the copyright law, you need to consider the following 4 questions when determining whether your use of copyrighted material can be considered fair use. Keep in mind that this definition of fair use is purposefully vague so that it can be applied to several cases without continually being revised. This ambiguity leaves a lot of interpretation to individual courts, which means if you have any doubt in your mind about your use, you need to err on the side of caution and exclude that particular work from your plans. First of all, what is the purpose of the use? If you're an educator, you're probably going to like this first question because nonprofit and educational use is usually seen favorably as well as used for criticizing, critiquing, or commentating on the work. If you are for-profit or a corporate organization, your use is usually seen less favorably when the courts establish fair use. Secondly, what is the nature of the work? The less artistic the work, the better. For example, nonfiction works are usually viewed more favorably than fiction works. Furthermore, you don't want to copy anything considered to be a consumable. If a workbook has been sent and is expected to be used by several students, you don't want to just buy one workbook and then make copies for everyone because that's going to impede on the intended nature of the work. The next question we want to consider is how much of the work is being used. Basically, the less the better, although there are no specific limits. Usually, as long as the meat of the original work is not included, you should be okay. But you only want to use as much as you need to use. The less you use, the better your argument for fair use. Finally, you want to determine how your use of the work affects the market. If it does affect the overall market, you probably shouldn't use it. If your use of the work cuts into the potential profits of the copyright holders or holder, you do not want to use it without permission. If you can expect reasonably that your students acquire a copy of this work or a license to use the work, then you should probably have them do that, as a court will more than likely rule in favor of the copyright holder if they can determine that they can reasonably expect your students to have purchased a copy of the work or a license to use the work. One final point about these 4 questions. The material that you want to use does not have to be in line with all of them. However, the more support you can find for your fair use argument, the better. That means if you've got 3 out of 4, you've got a pretty good argument. 1 out of 4, I wouldn't chance it. So keep that in mind whenever you're trying to determine if your use is fair use or not. Being educators, we have a little bit more leniency when determining fair use. It's not a license to use whatever we want, whenever we want, and however we want to, but the rules are a little bit more lax when they're applied to our field. Here are a couple of examples. First of all, the teaching exemption says that we can display or perform a copyrighted work in our classroom. That doesn't mean we can distribute a copyrighted work. That means you can display it in your classroom. Just one, not a copy for every student. Secondly, the TEACH Act. This allows teachers to transmit lectures, including copyrighted works, as long as it is transmitted exactly as it is presented in the classroom. That means if a student is absent for some reason and you want to podcast and send an audio version of your lecture to that student, then that's okay. If you want to send a video cast of your lecture or your class time to that student, that's okay under the TEACH Act. The last point on this slide is this fair use calculator. There are a lot of sites out there on the web that you can find that help you determine whether or not what you're doing is considered fair use. I like this one from the University of Minnesota. I found it the other day. Go ahead and enter that URL in your browser, and then you can go over to that site and you can answer some questions, fill out some criteria, and then it'll write a report for you to help you determine if it is fair use.
How does copyright and fair use affect teachers? Teachers should be very careful when using copyrighted material in order to avoid copyright infringement, which of course is a violation of the law. whenever a teacher violates copyright law, it is not just a matter of school liability or school system liability, but it is a matter of personal liability. That individual is responsible for making sure that he or she has gotten permission from the person whose material is being borrowed for instructional purposes. Some tips that teachers can use for uh, remember for using copyrighted material is: number one, follow your school or your school district's copyright usage policy. If you're not sure what that policy is, then of course in most cases you can look at the school's website, look at your faculty handbook, perhaps look at your school district employee handbook to see if there is a copyright usage policy. And if there is not a copyright usage policy in place, then perhaps you could be one of the teachers who could maybe work with the administration to compose a copyright usage policy, because it is very important, especially in this day and age of technology and using multimedia presentations. Number two, instead of cutting and pasting your text and images from the internet, use links to connect your class with the material that is in your lessons. Instead of actually cutting and pasting those pictures or the text that you might use in your lesson, provide the link so that if the students would like to go to those images or go to that text or that information, they can actually go to the link. And if you use the link instead of cutting and pasting the images, then you will not be in violation of the fair use or copyright law. And number three, if your classroom has a smart board, which in this day and time many of our classrooms do, then Smart Technology provides an application called Global Grid for Learning, and it is actually a collection of over 1 million pieces of copyright cleared text images, video clips, audio files, anything that you think you might be able to use in your classroom for instruction. You can find it with this Global Grid for Learning, and it's there for you if you have the smart board in your classroom. It's a very useful tool, and it will also help you avoid any infringement of copyrighted material that you might run into. One other thing that I would like to mention here when using copyrighted material in the classroom is something that most teachers are guilty of doing. When you have a day that you want to just show a film to your students, for instance, if you wanted to show your students a Disney film, a particular Disney film, unless there is a designated purpose or a lesson that you're trying to teach, perhaps you're talking about Disney films or there's a concept that you're using in that Disney film, it is actually a violation of copyright law for you to just bring that movie in for the kids to watch because there's nothing else for them to do that day, or you want to stick a video in while you give the kids a free day and you grade some papers or what have you. You need to make sure that you follow those rules for copyright to ensure that you're not in violation of that law. Why should teachers care about copyright and fair use? Well, there are two primary reasons for being conscientious about the use of other people's materials. First of all, teachers should show their students how to responsibly use the intellectual property of others. In other words, students need to know, and they need to also witness, that their teachers are not just haphazardly copying other people's materials for use in class or for their own personal uses, for that fact. They need to know that there are limitations on what can be used and how many copies of the material being used can be prepared. Also, teachers need to care about copyright and fair use because their primary objective should be to avoid breaking the law. Of course, the copyright law has been put in place to protect the creators of intellectual property from misuse and theft by others. So, teachers need to be conscientious of these rules in order to avoid violating those laws that have been created. There are some helpful reminders about what you can copy. Single copies of a book, chapter, not the entire book, just the book chapter or particular chapters from a book, magazine or newspaper articles, short stories and poems, diagrams and pictures for research or preparation purposes only. In other words, if you're making a copy of a chapter from a book that you are preparing a lesson for, and you don't want to take the entire book home, you just need to take that particular chapter that you're going to make your lesson plans from. Then copyright law and fair use says that you can make a copy of that chapter as long as it is being used for preparation purposes. Or if, for instance, you are working on a research project and you need to just copy a particular newspaper or magazine article, you can make a copy of that article or newspaper clipping without being in violation of the copyright law. Multiple copies of a work are also permissible if they are for classroom use or discussion. Now keep in mind that only one copy per pupil in your class is allowed to be made. If you're trying to make 150 copies for all 150 of your students, then this is a violation of the copyright and fair use law. Now, when we are talking about multiple copies, we can make a copy of a poem that is 250 lines or less, 250 words, 250 words or less. If the poem consists of more than 250 words, then you have to get permission from the original publisher in order to use that poem. You may also use excerpts from books that are 2,500 words or less. If the copy consists of more than 2,500 words, and of course you will have to get permission. You can also use excerpts from works that include one picture or one diagram. If there's more than one picture or diagram on the material that you plan to copy, then you must get permission in order to use it. The copying of the material has to be for one class only, and you may copy no more than one poem or one article or one story from the same person within a particular class term. In other words, you cannot copy repeatedly from the same author's work without getting copyright permission from that person. Finally, a teacher cannot make more than 9 copies or have more than 9 instances of copying from a particular work within a class term. In other words, you cannot altogether, have more than 9 instances of making multiple copies. So if you're going to study 10 different stories in your class and you do not have a classroom set that is provided by the school system, and you decide to make copies of these stories to use, you may only make multiple copies of 9 of those stories for classroom use. The 10th story will put you in a place where you will have to get permission from the person who published the story or the writer of the story in order to keep from violating copyright and fair use laws.